Camille Cipollone.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to speak to part one and the fact that this does give the Minister the ability to sell off land to private providers. And I just want to reflect, Mr. Chair, a little bit, because the power in part one of this bill is all going to, as we know, the Minister of Social Housing, Paula Bennett, and the Finance Minister, Bill English. And I just want to reflect on some of the things that have been happening in the Housing New Zealand space over the last year at least, Mr. Chair, because it really does cause us to have to stop and think whether or not the government is making the right decision in terms of whether or not those ministers have the competence to be able to make decisions on behalf of New Zealand with regards to these sales, Mr. Chair. I was just saying to my colleague Phil Twyford that I just had another constituent case come through where a couple with major health problems are not able to find a private rental, made an appointment with Housing New Zealand at the WINS office, got there was a mix-up, they said, sorry, no one can see you about your housing right now. They're very upset, they have 1 week to get out of their house. Mr. Chair, they said to Work and Income New Zealand, what will happen if we can't find a private rental by next week? And Work and Income New Zealand said to them, well, we can help you with emergency accommodation. We can put you up in this motel for the week. It'll cost $168 per night, but Work and Income New Zealand will pay for it. Now, what Work and Income New Zealand never seemed to tell these people is that actually they have to pay that money back, Mr. Chair. And why are we in this position anyway? We're in this position because we have a major housing demand going on in places like Auckland. These people can't get into private rentals. Housing New Zealand is not responding to their needs, and so they're saying go to a motel for $168 per night. This family who can't even afford a private rental, Mr. Speaker, and they're being told pay $168, but they're not being paid actually that they're going to have to pay it back. They're being told that Work and Income New Zealand will pay it. But the issue here, Mr. Chair, is in front of us is this piece of legislation where we're looking at the fact that the government is going to sell off Housing New Zealand houses, and yet every day through our office doors we're seeing people that need access to Housing New Zealand houses, Mr. Chair. And we listened to Nick Smith saying that this is the government's attempt to do something about the housing crisis. Well, it's not building on the stock that we currently have. It's not increasing the stock, it's shifting the stock over to the community housing providers. And I think Mr. Nick Smith fails to recognise that that is the case. Mr. Chair, I've got a question for the Minister, and I want to know from the Minister what happens if the social housing provider goes bust. Does and all of a sudden those houses are going to be sold. Does the government, does Housing New Zealand have the first opportunity to buy that back? I'm asking that question, but I'm also going to say with that I've got concerns even if that is the case, because we've seen with projects like the Waterview Connection project.
That's not on part one what you're talking about now. That's not on part one.
Okay, Mr. Chair. Well, I'll talk about it in part two then. So, Mr. Chair, going back to what I was saying before about the way in which we've seen Housing New Zealand run into the ground, it does mean that for many of us, we have questions in our mind about the competence of the Minister to be able to make decisions around land sales, to make decisions around housing sales. Mr. Chair, in the Select Committee, we had it made very known to us that the Minister, yes, would have all the power when it comes to selling these houses, but it's concerning because none of the responsibility if anything goes wrong in the transaction. All of the responsibility is going to fall back on Housing New Zealand, despite the fact that they don't get to make the decisions. They don't have the power to make decisions about these sales, Mr. Chair. It makes no sense to us on this side of the House. In fact, it seems incredibly unfair. And if the Minister is going to have this power, which of course we disapprove with, but the government is pushing for, if the Minister is going to have this power, the Minister should also be held accountable if anything goes wrong in the transaction, Mr. Chair. So I'm concerned that that doesn't seem to be the case. And in fact, in many of the submissions that were made during the Select Committee, that was raised as a real issue for those making the submissions as well, because they could see the unfairness in the way in which this was panning out, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, going back to what we're seeing here in part one, this is about This is about the power that has been passed on to the ministers, and we've never seen anything like this before. As many of my colleagues have said, Mr. Chair.
Jamie Lee Ross.